We have a Trek rail here. It's a E-mountain bike. This is outfitted with their top-of-the-line XTR build. This bike's in pretty good shape, but it does have a few things that need to be addressed on it. With tires, we really like to have them match. That's not really a function thing, it's more of an aesthetic thing, but we like our bikes to look good as much as we like them to function properly. So we're gonna go ahead and replace the front since it's in a little worse shape. We also noticed during our inspection here that the dropper post has a lot of twists side to side. So this twist is not really acceptable as far as our standards go, so we are gonna replace the dropper post. We did notice on this side of our crank, at some point when pedals were being installed and removed, these threads got marred a little bit and they're not really in the best of shape. So we're likely we can sometimes repair threads, but I think we're likely gonna replace this crank arm itself. We're also going to replace the hub bearings on here with the chain removed, which it is on this. You can kind of spin the wheel and put your hand on the frame and feel, and if there's a lot of vibration or noise, lets us know that those bearings are kind of on their way out, which you can definitely feel on this, and vibrating a little bit. We also will hold the rim and frame and try and look for play side to side. This doesn't have any of that side to side play, but the vibration is enough to warrant replacing these bearings on this.
This morning we have a 2021 Trek Rail 9.9 electric mountain bike. Pretty obvious why we're replacing this seat post today. It's not supposed to do that. So we'll go ahead and get the wheels off and get rolling. I am going to be trying to get the battery out just to make it a little bit easier to move the cable around when I remove the dropper. Push it down, make sure it stays down, and then make sure it'll go back up with an adequate amount of lever travel. So in this case, it looks like the pedal threads were determined to be too far gone. So we're actually going to go ahead and install a new crankset on this bike. So it should be a pretty simple fix here. So one thing that's worth noting here before we install the new cranks is that unlike an analog bike, the chainring and the spider is not actually installed on the crank arm. It's part of the motor unit. And so you do want to make sure, this might have even been the reason that the pedal threads are damaged on the old one, I forgot to check. But when you're installing the new ones, you want to make sure that you get the right and the left side crank arm in the right spot. It's really easy to screw up if you're not paying attention because they look the same. The only difference is the threading on the pedal threads, because just like on a BSA bottom bracket, they are threaded opposite on one side to keep themselves from unthreading while you pedal. So I'm going to look closely here and make sure that I see, got my drive side right crank arm here, so I'm going to go ahead and install that here. As always, I like to just put a very thin layer of grease on the splines and on the pedal threads. Right now, I'm just looking for it to be snug and that it's not going to go anywhere. When it goes through the line in the drivetrain step, they will make sure that it's torqued to its correct spec. We have the crankset on. We can go ahead and address this hub issue. Rough bearings on the rear hub. They're actually not too notched, but they're really noisy. So to access all this stuff, best practices is to get everything you can out of the way. So I like to go ahead and remove our rotor. Grab our Crombie and vice whip. Lock that down on and get the cassette off too. So now we can begin the process of disassembling the hub and accessing our bearings. In this case, our non-drive side end cap is just pressed on. And so I just like to grab a wrench and very carefully wiggle it on out until it finally goes. You do want to be gentle with that step, especially if you're using a more aggressive wrench like the Knipex. If you go at it a little bit too hard, it can actually damage the soft aluminum end cap, making it potentially even ovalized, and so then you can't get the through axle in and out effectively. So just be aware of that when you're pulling those out. There's actually the same deal on this one. So we have the axle out of the bike and one of the bearings out of the hub. So we'll go ahead and set that aside for now. We've also taken out the pawls and pawl springs from our free hub body. We kind of need to do that anyway when we're pulling the bearings so they don't go flying. You'll see in the next step why. So what I like to do is go ahead and soak those in a little bit of degreaser inside of an old tape container. Get everything cleaned up, get all the old grease and grit out of those. So we'll go ahead and take our free hub body over to our bearing bench and pull out our old hub bearings. Here we have a slide hammer with all the different drifts inside of them to lock in. That'll help us especially pull out this first bearing because there is a spacer sleeve on the inside to make sure that the bearings stay preloaded correctly. So you thread that in, lock the flange into the back side of the bearing, thread the drift into the hammer. I like to cover the free hub body with my hand so that all the sharp edges don't cut you as you pull the bearing out. Give it a good pull and the bearing will slide out. That doesn't always work so nicely. Sometimes they're in there a little bit more stiffly. And in this case, it's actually 2 bearings, so we get to do that one more time. Keep track of that sleeve. And take a look inside of here. We have one more bearing for the other side. So we actually have 2 sleeves on this one. And the thing to keep track of in here is that we actually have a snap ring that keeps the outer bearing located. So I'll go ahead and grab my snap ring pliers. Yank that out. Set that aside as well. Go ahead and get the slide hammer in here. The bearing comes out same side as all the other ones. This one can be a little bit tricky because its bearing seat is actually almost the same diameter as all the other ones. So I have to pull it all the way through the free hub body and out this side. The trick there that makes that a little bit more difficult sometimes is that the bearing itself can get a little bit crooked inside of the bearing bore and get stuck. We'll see if I can avoid that. So I got it almost all the way out before that happened. Grab a punch and a hammer. We'll see if we can't just get the bearing out this way. Yeah. This is where we have to put our problem-solving hats on every once in a while. In this case, I think I might be able to get it most of the way back out just with a little bit of creativity using my bearing presses. All right, now it's where it's supposed to be. We can grab our slide hammer one more time. Get it on out finally. These are all going to be the same size bearing. Go ahead and clean the dirt off of the seal where the bearing size is printed. We have a 6803 bearing. Find our 6803s. Grab 3 of them. And get them all reinstalled. So not always a whole lot of difference outwardly that you can tell. These new ones that we have a blue seal instead of the orange ones on the originals. And when we rotate them, we can feel that even with just a little bit of load on these old bearings, there's definitely some roughness. You can feel a little bit of grit in there. This one's nice and smooth, even a little bit tight, which is exactly what we want with brand new seals. So we'll go ahead and get our drifts together here. In this case, I'm just using a larger drift that'll sit flush on the outside of the free hub body to keep everything parallel while I insert my new bearing into the bore on the drift that I need there. And I'm gonna go ahead and push it on through. We're gonna run into a similar problem that we did trying to get this one out, that we did getting it in. So I'm just gonna redo my spacer configurations a little bit. Put my drift back on the bearing, and then toss these spacers on the outside so that I can push it all the way in. Snug it down. Don't forget my snap ring. Snap rings and spacers are so easy to forget when you're reinstalling. You just get into the habit of throwing all the bearings in and you forget the small parts. But we get that in there, get it seated in its spot. Get our 2 spacer sleeves there. And grab our last 2 bearings. I'm gonna do these one at a time to make sure that they stay aligned properly. I could try to stack them, but the drift is only deep enough for one. So if I stack them, they can get crooked, cause myself some problems. So I'm just gonna go ahead and take my time and do one and then the other. Everything's snugged down. Go ahead and take a look. Make sure everything looks good. Those sleeves on the inside are aligned. They can move around just a little bit, which is good. So that when we compress everything down, once we put the wheel back together, it sets the bearing preload correctly. And then I just want to make sure that there's no binding on these ones, telling me that they're crooked or misinstalled. So that feels good to me. So I can go ahead and take this back to my main bench, and we'll be doing the same thing for the main hub. My next step here is actually going to be finishing up the reassembly of the free hub body. We'll go ahead and take our pawls and pawl springs out of the degreaser. There's a lot of hubs that used to use springs like this, coil springs, and now they've moved on to more of a leaf spring or magnets, which is really nice because these are super easy to lose and misplace. But here we go, 6 and 6. So we're all good to go there. I like to put a little bit of grease inside of the holes for the springs where they sit. They already want to go flying enough. I don't need to make it even easier. It is important in a situation like this to use a lightweight grease if you're going to do this, such as this Dumantech free hub grease, which is specifically designed for this application. If you use something more like a traditional hub grease, some are worse than others, but especially like a traditional Park Tool green grease or Finish Line Teflon grease that a lot of people like to use, that can be really gummy, and then it'll actually cause the springs to stick. Now that I have all of my springs into place, we can go ahead and put the pawls themselves in. Make sure you got the right orientation on them. I like to use a small flathead screwdriver to push down the spring while I slide the pawl into place. Make sure it doesn't get jammed underneath the spring. Got all the pawls into place. Now I like to grab a little bit of oil, just 1 or 2 drops per pawl. It's like always, I try to just minimize metal to metal contact where I can. This helps keep them lasting a little bit longer, running a little bit smoother and quieter. So now we can go ahead and wrap everything up. Grab our second hub bearing. Toss a light layer of grease on the axle. Then I like to fit my bearing and my end cap on the axle like this, slide it through, get everything seated, and then you can give it a quick whack with the hammer to seat that non-drive bearing into place. Toss a little grease inside the free hub mechanism. Get our end cap installed. I'm going to go ahead and toss it up in the truing stand, tighten everything down, give it another quick spin, make sure there's no play in the system, and reinstall the cassette and the brake rotor. It's definitely something that takes a bit of a practiced hand when you're using power tools. If you're not used to this, it can be really easy to accidentally cross-thread the bolts. So you always also want to start slow, even when you're doing this a lot. With the e-bikes, they do have a magnet. In this case, the magnet's built into the disc rotor mounting interface. So I'm going to go ahead and start the first 4 bolts, going in my cross pattern as much as I can. So I've got all the other ones in. I'm going to go ahead and install the magnet on here. This is a very important piece of equipment. In this case, it doesn't just tell you how fast you're going when you look at your computer. It's actually letting the bike know what's going on so that it can regulate your speed and any power assist settings that you have set so that it works properly. Good enough for now. The line will go ahead and put their wrenches on it, and at the QC step, make sure that those bolts are hitting the proper torque. So now that we've done the new bearings, reinstalled the rotor and cassette, we can go ahead and put this back in the bike. One final check, there's no play, no binding. That's good to go.